Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the Doubting Tim Show. I'm here alongside my friends Chris and Isaiah. Once again, we are super happy to be back. In our first episode, along with introductions, we kind of came across the topic of what we labeled performance-based faith and how Chris and Isaiah have sort of transitioned their life from performance-based faith to this like love relationship that they have. And we didn't really get a chance to dive into it. We all kind of agreed this would be a great place to start. Going to make a disclaimer though, this is not like a hardcore, theology type whatever. We're not sitting here pitching saying, we did this. We're growing just like everybody else. We're attempting to have that kind of dialogue with ourselves, with each other, and just kind of encourage the community to ask the questions, have the answers and stuff. So that being said, to refresh everybody, the question was sort of like when it comes to walking that line in your relationship with the Lord, do we find ourselves more on the performance-based fear side, or should we be finding ourselves more on the love-based side, and why? That was sort of the question we had. So you guys can go ahead and what do you feel about that?
I have many strong feelings.
All right, Zay, we'll start with you.
But
then.
you can go.
We'll start.
first,
No, we'll start with Zay.
Okay, I'll start. Well, to go to scripture, 1 John 4:18. Oh, that's the other way around. Anyways, 1 John 4:18. I'm gonna read it because like sharing the screen would get kind of weird or whatever. But it says NIV. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love.
Can I just stop you real quick?
Sure, go for it.
So, the morning after we did our last show and we posed that question, I woke up to that verse being the verse of the day on my Bible app on my phone.
Oh
Oh,
wow. Nice.
that's pretty
So
sweet.
I tagged that and put it in my thing to say, hey, this happened. And then you just put it up there. So,
Which
all right,
which
go
one was
ahead,
it?
Shay.
Which one was it? You said First John what?
1 John
4:18.
4:18.
First John.
Yeah, so there's the Gospel of John, and then he wrote three more letters. They're
Yeah.
towards the end. They're like
Okay.
the First John's like the fifth to last book, fourth to last book.
They're small too.
Okay, you
Yeah.
continue. I found it.
So basically, I think that there are places in the Bible where it refers to the fear of the Lord being something that is part of wisdom and should be part of our lives, but that fear isn't talking so much about the fear that we often think about. It's not about being afraid of him or the punishment that might come from him, but more of a reverence and an understanding of his position versus the world, and that like God is above it all. So there should be a fear in that sense, but I don't think fear should ever be part of the Christian like daily walk. And like it says in this verse, fear has to do with punishment. If I'm walking out my life basing my behavior on fear, then it's because I'm afraid of something bad happening. Like the reality is I don't believe that God has bad to give. I think he only has good. And as a good father who loves and wants connection with me, I walk out my behavior based on love. And this idea of like perfect love casts out fear, that in the presence of love, there actually isn't fear. And that's true in human relationships too. Now, where we all struggle, we don't have perfect love because of our choices, but we have access to it. And so through that, we can, in segments of time or in seasons or in certain relationships, have that kind of love in relationships. And we've all probably experienced it in small doses or whatever, where we're like, wow, I feel so accepted by this person. I don't have to change or think about who I am around them. And I think that God desires that sort of relationship with us, where it's you actually are who you're supposed to be when you're with God, because he's the one who gave your identity originally.
Right.
And what he gave was only good. He couldn't give bad. So
Yeah.
that's what walking it out should look like, is me walking in perfect love instead of in fear.
So can I hit you with two things real quick before I pass it to you? Don't have to answer both of them. So
Sure.
I like that you brought back up that whole like perfect love thing because you mentioned it last week. you talked about how we strive for it, we crave it, right? Like we have these things in our marriage vows because we want that perfect love in the relationship we have with God, with our Father. So, in looking at that, can you, because you're right, fear is brought up a lot, right? Like these people don't fear God, they don't fear God, or I'm in fear of God. That those wordings are all over. What what does so you defined it a little bit. What does that like really firmly mean? Like, give me like your bare minimum definition, fearing God.
Bare minimum.
Because
Hard to
you said
describe
sorry,
it.
so like you said like
Yeah, yeah.
it was
No, I
from
understand what you're asking.
it was from like a judgment perspective, right? Like to fear God actually means to like be concerned with the judgment that's going to be placed on you.
I so I would define it as this, and it is often in the Old Testament. I mean, what you're talking about, most of those references are
Yeah.
Old Testament, right? I think the fear of God had to do with the
Did we lose him?
He's frozen.
Oh,
Oh,
you're
did I
back.
freeze?
No, yeah, you're back. You're back. The fear of God has to do with.
Okay, sorry. Has to do with the reverence due God because he is beyond man's control.
Okay.
In a world where men create gods, you don't have to be afraid of a God created by man. But God is something beyond the earth, and he should actually have a reverence or a respect that is beyond the normal kind of,
Yeah.
spirituality of man.
Okay. So the
Exactly.
human emotion that we could apply to it in an attempt to comprehend it was fear. Okay.
And the English word too, because in the Hebrew there are different words, whereas we have like reverence and admiration and respect don't really encompass all that word was meant to mean, whereas fear is closer to it, but it's not supposed to be the oh my gosh kind of fear. It was more of like the fear that you get when you walk into a giant, I'm just picturing like a giant Roman cathedral, and it's just like it's so big and so amazing that you're almost afraid to be there alone. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Okay. Chris, what'd you find?
Honestly, very similar.
Okay.
To go back to your first point, Zay, and talking about that perfect love relationship, that's something I have found in my own marriage, and that I think does apply to God, and that our marriage relationships are supposed to reflect our relationship with God. But in that, Morgan is the only person whose approval I really actually desire. You know, obviously I want the other people in my life to approve of me, to like me. But if everybody else turned their backs on me and said, I'm done with you, if I had Morgan, that's enough because she is my wife and that is our relationship. And so in that, she's also the only person whose disapproval I actually fear. You know. But that
I like
being
that.
said, I also know that she loves me and that she loves me unconditionally, as much as any human can do that. And so, I fear her disapproval, but I know that she loves all of the parts of me that are imperfect. And so I know that all of my failings, all the things I do wrong, will be and already are forgiven. And therefore, I don't have to fear her disapproval. And so, the fear that would exist and does exist is therefore mitigated. And even though it's still there, it is kind of subsumed in just this joy and freedom of she loves me and she forgives me for all of the bad things that I may be and do, and so I
accepts
don't
you.
have to fear.
Yeah. Okay. So then, looking at that relationship, the one you just described, which one of those understandings came first? Did your relationship with Morgan help you kind of understand the relationship you should have with God, or was it your relationship with God and the growth through that allowed you to realize this is the relationship I need to have with Morgan?
Well, as far as Morgan specifically, the understanding with God definitely came first. Um, However, I will say my understanding of true love and the marriage relationship came kind of in concert with my understanding of God's love. Um, kind of as I matured and grew through that phase of understanding what God's love is and what his love actually means in our lives, it kind of opened up my understanding of our human love relationships. And so, kind of in that process, I gained a very different perspective on dating and marriage and, finding a wife, um, which kind of happened in, the 6 months or so before I actually met Morgan. So it was
How'd you
very
meet
good.
your wife?
Yeah. It was very good timing on God's part as far as bringing me to that understanding before I met her.
Okay.
So,
Zay, responses? You want me to take my shot? It's up to you.
Yeah, you can take your shots. I mean, I'm cool to kind of bounce back and forth if you want to.
Okay. So the reason that I think that I wanted it to go to mine is I obviously found something like completely different. So I'm like the commoner of our group, right? I'm the newest saved member. And so yeah, I think it's a good way for like the audience to understand, right? Because if they're looking at the three of us, I'm the newest to this, which means I'm the person who's either gonna like discover things and be like, this is the greatest thing in the world, or I'm gonna believe something is like here, and you guys are gonna be like, well, it's actually like more over here because you need to understand these other passages. So I found, and again, I might be like totally quoting or citing these wrong, Matthew 22, 37 to 39. And the reason that I picked that, in here, this is when the scribes, when they ask which is like the first commandment of all of them, when I thought about that performance based, I thought about the 10 commandments, and I thought about which, like we have to do all of these things. And one of the most overwhelming things that happened to me in these last couple weeks, that I've been talking to my friend Robin about and you guys about, was there's just no way, right? Like I look at all these things, I think about my flaws as a human being, and I think that how am I going to accomplish these things? And so I go in here and I find that, when Jesus says to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And when I read that and I thought about that one I could do. Not that I wanted to say, oh, thank goodness I only have to focus on those two things. That's not where I was coming from. But it was from that if those are the two most important things to do, and by doing those two things, I will be able to stay away from all of the other things I shouldn't be doing, then I'm good, because I felt like I've done those things for most of my life, and I felt like those things I can do, right? I can use these gifts that I've been given, this love and this empathy, to work with the kids that I work with, wake up every day and attempt to change the lives of people around me and discriminate against no one. Anyone who needs love and support, I can do those things. And I know that I'm doing those things because of the blessing I've been given, because of the path that I have, because of my salvation, all of these things with Jesus I'm now able to do. That sent a powerful message to me. So how does that resonate with you?
I mean, I love that passage. One of the first sermons I did at this church that I'm here in Michigan was on that passage. So I might share that with you if you want to give it a listen. But
well, okay, so
I think that
paraphrase right now. Give us like a 2-minute rundown of that sermon.
2-minute rundown of it is, so loving the Lord your God with all of you has to be your source of love, and that there has to be this in order for the other two. But the loving your neighbor as yourself, the as is like a conjunction phrase that only means like you can't do one without the other, and they're equal to each other. And so my sermon was talking about how to love yourself and how that's actually important, because a lot of the Christianity I grew up in was all about you love God and you love others and you come last, and that's how you be happy. Joy is Jesus, others, yourself. And how that's actually twisted, and that this commandment makes it very clear that like if God's my source of love, I should have equal love for myself as I do for anyone else. And you even kind of brought that up. Like I have just as much grace for anyone else as for myself. I should forgive everyone the way that I've been forgiven, love everyone the way I've been loved, and just that kind of connection of being a
Right.
good neighbor is loving yourself the way God has told
Correct.
you to,
And I think, and
and
on
that
that,
allows you to love
yeah,
others.
and on that point, Chris and I have had a bunch of conversations. So I'll ask Chris because he remembers about this. One of the conversations Chris and I had in Brockport was on forgiving ourselves and on
Yeah.
some of the actions that we have to do, because we do have that distraction, right? We look at everybody else and we think they're human beings, they make mistakes, they deserve our forgiveness. Granted, the consequences might still be there, but we see people forgiving others all the time. And yet we have such a hard time when we make mistakes forgiving ourselves. And I think you're right, Zay, like having it rooted makes it easier for us to kind of just grasp everything because that source of power is consistent and the same.
No, yeah, I remember that conversation, and that's definitely something, when I was going through that maturation process of the moving past the performance-based faith of, um, yet learning that, if I am always willing to forgive the people around me for the things that they have done and say, like you said, well, Jesus died for them and they are forgiven, and so I will forgive them. Why am I holding that back from myself? And that in that view, I am actually limiting my own capacity to love others because I have the guilt in there that holds you back from that.
Yeah.
So,
Zay?
I also just wanted to like I mean, obviously I love both you guys and I love your views and the way you communicate. There was something Chris brought up I wanted to jump off of, but I can't remember. Anyways, the idea that the relationship, right, the non-performance, the working out of love. Oh, when he was talking about his wife and the idea of like the same is true of a parent and child relationship, right?
mm-hmm.
There should be this unconditional love and nurturing and always acceptance, right? Talking about a healthy one, obviously.
Yeah.
But the child does have a sort of fear, and it shouldn't be a fear based out of punishment, because there is like, oh, if I mess up, dad might spank me. I get that from a human point of view, and if you didn't necessarily have really loving parents, it could be really hard to grasp this concept. But the idea that there can be a fear of my parent that isn't based out of what might hurt, but is instead based out of the fact that like they mean so much to me and what they say impacts my life so much. I actually have a fear of like, and how Chris was saying, like with Morgan, like there's a vulnerability in that, like they could destroy me.
Yeah.
If my
if they
father
don't
and
approve
mother
of what I am, if I disappoint them somehow.
So there's like a fear because it means so much to me what they think about me.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I have this unquestionable belief that they will accept and love me unconditionally, which empowers me to be myself without the fear controlling.
Mm-hmm.
But like there is a fear there. And again, fear is a limited word because we're in English and we only have one word, and we don't have like the spectrum of what we're really saying for each thing. But
yeah,
I like that analogy.
Because it felt a little bit when you were just talking about like guilt kind of crept in there a little bit, right? Not because you especially when you talk about your family, right? And me looking up to my mom and my dad, and that fear of I never wanted them to be ashamed of things that I'd done. Now, I knew I could make just about any mistake in the world, and my parents were going to work with me through that, right? They had that forgiveness, that love, that support. But that weighed down on me and my conscience to not make those choices, right? And I think that really directed me, and like I like that we're using fear in that aspect, because a lot of the fear that most human beings know is that fear of being spanked, that fear of this punishment. And I try to get the kids that I work with to understand, and that I kind of explain to my coworkers, you're obviously physically stronger than a 4-year-old or a 2-year-old, but aren't you also smarter than them? So why aren't you attempting to find some kind of relationship and discipline where you just are smarter than them? Because we have ways to teach
them
yes.
the wisdom of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Explain. We'll go to you.
to Chris.
Well, because
Um,
simply because wisdom is a word that it gets brought up all the time, right? Like, what are wise men, right? And Jesus defines people as being wise men. Do you want to have this wisdom? The fact that you brought it up, you're right. Teach them the wisdom of the situation.
well, and that's something that, as far as wisdom, is said a lot in the Old Testament, especially in like Proverbs, that fearing the Lord is wisdom. And I think one of the things that where that comes from is just, and Zay touched on it a little bit earlier, of just what fear is and where it comes from and what it's based out of, and just fear is us recognizing that something else has control over the situation that we're in, and whatever that something is, may hurt us or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, you know? And so if, if that's what fear is, if we recognize that God is greater than all of these other forces in the world, and so we then recognize that, whatever thing, if I'm afraid of heights, that what I'm saying is gravity has more control over the situation than I do.
Right. You have a very vast respect for that situation.
And you
but
can have
then-
that without it actually being a fear.
Yeah, but also, just in that situation, then you're recognizing that God has more control than even the force of gravity. Not saying I'm just going to go run off a cliff, but when it comes to our fear, God is bigger than whatever it is we're afraid of.
Mhm.
And so, if that's what we're recognizing, then we recognize that God has that control. And so ultimately, God is the only thing we should fear.
Yeah.
Right.
But as we said before, because of the love that we know He has for us, we know that He's watching over us and that His will for us is good and great and best. And so we don't have to fear everything else in the world if we fear God. And that's where I think the wisdom aspect comes into it,
Mhm.
of being able to recognize that and say, I don't have to be afraid because God is in control.
Right. I'm like looking at the other things that I found and thinking to myself, like, I should probably save them. Zay, you got a point.
I wanted to jump in a whole nother direction.
Let's do it. Let's jump in a whole other direction.
I wanted to talk. We've talked about performance a lot in fear because they kind of go hand in hand.
Right. We've talked about this half.
I just want to talk about like what performance is a little bit and why we choose it,
Mhm.
and why that plays into the fear versus a love relationship.
Okay.
So, performance is a source of identity based in comparison, and the world loves that because it's controllable and noticeable, and something that gives me
thing.
measurable. It's concrete. I can say, well, I'm doing better than this person because I don't, whatever my rules are. My rules can be no drinking. My rules can be, well, I haven't done drugs, so it doesn't matter that I'm doing these other things because I'm not as bad as those people. I'm a
Right.
better Christian.
Yes.
Performance is all comes down to like a source of identity that isn't God, but it's something that I can control. And then if I perform really well, then I can feel even better about myself.
That is so true.
Is the lie that you believe when you choose performance, right?
Well, it's the parable of the vineyard.
What was that?
The parable of the vineyard. When Jesus is telling them, and he sends all these people out, he says, I'll give you this X amount of dollars if you just go work here. And then every hour of the day, he goes and gets somebody else, and he pays everybody the same. And he's pretty much asking, why aren't you just as excited that everybody else got to work and get paid? Why are you so upset that you are worth more than another human being? Why are you worth more than somebody else?
Right. Why is it about, and that's the thing, performance
that's
also
about
wants it
me.
to be fair.
Yes.
It wants it to be, well, God, if I did all this, then why haven't you given, like, where's my car, my house, because I've been spreading the gospel like you told me to, right? And it becomes this check and balance. And again, it's all about something I can control, something that I can measure, and it gives me a sense of identity. But in the end, it all ends up being hollow and very isolating because it's not relationship.
Right.
and it doesn't give place to love. You're actually choosing something that is the opposite of love. Comparison and love don't go hand in hand, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
and it says that we're not supposed to compare.
Yeah.
Galatians 6 talks about how you should be able to do everything on your own without comparing to anyone.
Mhm.
And that performance wants to create that. So when you're afraid, when fear is part of how you see God, performance makes a lot of sense. And you choose that, and then you just try to be the best you can be, and keep thinking that hopefully one day when I figure this out, one day when I stop looking at porn, or one day when I stop whatever gossiping, when I get over this sin, or when I finally, find a good wife or good husband, like that's when things will line up and I'll feel good about myself.
Yeah.
Because you see that as your identity you're trying to achieve, when the reality is your identity should just come from what God says you are, and it remains the same. He's called you whatever it is. He's called you son. He's called you inheritor. He's called you a priest. He's called you
Right.
pure. He's called you holy, set apart, righteous.
Mhm.
That's who you are. And if that is where you get your identity, performance looks really dumb.
Yes. It
And
does.
then it makes a lot more sense to walk in love as opposed to fear.
Right.
True.
All right.
That is
So
true.
I'll say just one thing and then I'll let Chris respond because I know Chris is like, I can see him. He's like going for this.
He's like, just,
Again, from the commoner perspective, one of the things when I looked at that parable of the vineyard and I listened to what you said, I thought about this. From our human nature standpoint, from the way society wants us to believe that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you work super hard, you get all these great things, right? And if you work harder than everybody else, you get more things than everybody else. Well, we're all gonna, like, the parable is like when you walk into eternity and you're like, it's just wow, or whatever we can imagine it is, we get there and we look around, we are not going to be looking at other people going, he got in? Dude, I could have screwed around so much harder if I knew that that was the standard, right? That's not what we're supposed to be. We're going to get there and we're going to be so stoked at all these other people that made it here with us, and probably have more of the I'm so happy this person made it because I was so worried because you were
even if it
struggling
was
with
the
these
last
things.
hour,
Right, even if it was the last hour. And that's something from our human brain we can't really grasp, right? Well, that's not
Yeah.
fair. This guy spent his whole life doing whatever he wanted to, and in the last second he got saved. Like, God, dude, I've been saved since I was 5. Come on, bro. Like, help me out. And I think that lesson in itself carries over everywhere, to the relationships you have with your family, to relationships you have with your coworkers, of never stopping to strive to make that difference to them. That and we talked about this in one of our sermons of like, the coming of Jesus will be so fast that you can't even comprehend it, right? So that being said, the change towards salvation in a human, in our spirit, in our soul, is faster than we can comprehend. So it's never waste time. Never give up on that opportunity to share your love and share your gift with somebody else, because you don't know when it's going to be that moment.
Mhm.
Sorry,
No, that's good.
I just got
Those
I
are all
got
It
very
was good.
I got
Good
excited.
insights. That's good stuff.
I'll drink so I can't talk now.
No, and I do like what Tim said about that, about the that end goal, that final, what you see, um, because if we can keep that in mind in our human relationships, it can change our perspective so much, and you live your life with so much more joy when you give up on those comparisons. Um, you know, so many people live their lives without ever feeling contentment and joy with their situation and who they are and what they have. Um, and it's something most people who have been in church for a while have probably done some kind of mission work. And we go on like short-term mission trips to Central America or Africa or something like that. And you see the people there who are living with so much less than what we have here, and yet they seem to have so much more joy than we do. And that is one of those situations that it just can show us how the American way and the American perspective can be so damaging to our spiritual selves, in that idea of comparing. Um, and that being said, for ourselves, we always want to strive to be our best self, but that is for ourselves, in our own personal walk with God and our own personal connection with God. We want to be the best we can be for God and with God. And that has zero relationship to anybody around us.
Mhm.
So just that, like Zay was talking about, that idea of comparing, and it steals so much of what our life can be when we try to live that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go.
I'll say yeah. I mean, it steals life. Performance drives us. The thing about performance or comparison is there isn't ever an arrival. You can't ever win because there's always going to be another thing to. There's always going to be someone else you can compare to, right?
Mhm.
If you're the
And always-
richest in money, you might not have the most land. Like you can't. You can never get. You can't ever be.
Can't ever have everything. Yes.
And then in performance, there's never. You can't match God, and like trying to be God is what caused the fall of Satan and of man. Like the trying to be more like him. That's not the point. The point is instead to, like Chris is saying, strive to be the best self. Like I would just word it as to walk in your true identity, right? To cast off the sin nature, the mess that has come because of choices, and instead be who God made me to be, and that's what's actually satisfying. And then the stuff that brings true joy, right? Like connection and acceptance and love and all that comes from him, but like will happen in life as well, between family, finding a spouse, having kids. People get little tastes of what God's love is like, and they're like, wow, having a son or daughter changed my life. And it's like, yeah, you're experiencing what the love of the Father is like. And you can have that as like a nonstop thing because he loves you so much.
Yes.
That can be your whole life.
It can be your whole life. So just to kind of summarize as we get towards the end of this here, we've talked. We defined fear. We talked a lot about performance based. We touched on forgiveness a little bit, and one of the things that you had mentioned before, when you talked about finally reaching that destination, right? When I finally am able to just strip myself of this sin or of this burden or whatever it is, I find relating to keeping score in relationships. It's one of the terms. I'm using that term because we hear society throw it around a lot. You wind up in a relationship with somebody and you even mentioned the word winning, right? Well, you're either both going to win or you're both going to lose. And touching on some of Chris's points about his flaws have already been forgiven, right? The defects of ourselves have been embraced by this other person because defect, flaw, is a human term, right? We are who we are, and we're going to love that person no matter what. And to love that person means to love them. Everything they were, everything they're going to be, everything they could be, everything they are right now, everything, right? I love you. That's it, right? To quote Zay from last week. And I just thought, hearing what you guys were saying really resonated in how much better our relationships could be. And a mistake, to keep it brief, and I'll let you guys kind of make your closing statements, a mistake that I see people making is you find a relationship with this other person, and that's what we define as a relationship, right? So society would say, you guys to me are not a relationship, right? A relationship is me with my significant other. Well, if I understand what it means to love that person, and that by keeping score, we're both getting hurt, and that I'm attempting to find joy in that person's happiness, in that person's success, and by lifting them up and making them a better person, I'm going to feel better. They're going to return the favor for me. We have no fear. We have only trust. When I can carry that over to other relationships, then I start to really understand this true definition of love because I'm leaving myself short when I feel like the only person that deserves that relationship is my significant other or is God and my significant other. And that I can't, as they said, it doesn't meet in the middle, right? I have to pull from both sides coming from the power source. I'm going to love everybody else as I love myself. I can forgive everybody else as I forgive myself. Period.
Yeah, and that is true of our world in that, we are taught to pick and choose who we're going to love. We're taught to, only accept people who are like us. Only accept people who have these certain beliefs, and we don't recognize that we are all children of God, and that um, Jesus' command to us was to make disciples of all nations, and that in Revelation, John's vision was of people from every tongue and every tribe and every nation and every kind of people on the earth are a part of God's kingdom. And so we don't have that choice, we don't get to pick and choose. We do. We love all.
Zay? Closing points?
Closing points. Yeah, I think that when love is part of your identity, it's no longer a chore. It's still a choice, but like it's not that we're talking about going out waking up every day like, okay, I gotta love myself, and okay, I'm gonna love this idiot in traffic ahead of me.
I'm doing it.
You are awesome. Shut up and like it. No, it's not something about gritting your teeth and white knuckle and I'm gonna love people even though they annoy the crap out of me. It comes from something bigger than yourself.
Yes.
You can't do it on your own. It's not just something that you decide. It's actually, you have to accept fully who God says you are and the love he gives you. And from that overflow, it makes it easy to choose love even when people are annoying and frustrating. And when you're sitting in traffic or when you mess up and you really just want to tell yourself that you're stupid and say, I hate my life, and let shame come in, right? Love stands in the way of that. And if that is who I am and whose I am.
Or when you're at GP Detroit and all the cars have blocked the road and you really want to get back and you're debating going out. I'm just kidding.
No, I know. It's traffic is a place where I am tested. My patience, my love. So
it's good because we all have those things. It's good.
So that's what it is. That's the difference between performance. Performance is my choice, what I can control, what I can do. Love, working out of perfect love, working out a relationship and identity is changing who I am, allows me to make the choices that I wouldn't ever be able to do on my own.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the comments that my friend Robin, who I work with, had said that she always says like I could do a lot of great things, but there are these couple things I'm not so good at, and I know that if Jesus wasn't helping me, I'd probably be saying some pretty nasty things to some people. So I'm gonna, in order to end this, I'm gonna kind of ask you sort of your guys' opinion, because I had two other verses that I didn't bring up because in this conversation with you guys, I sort of understood that they felt somewhere else, and I really like this identity topic. And I think that the reason I like the identity topic is because I currently am struggling with that concept of sin, right? So the identity portion, the walk with God, and what we talked about tonight. And so the two that I found, Isaiah 66:3, where he says, "He who kills a bull is as if he slays a man. He who sacrifices a lamb as if he breaks a dog's neck. He who offers a grain offering as if he offers swine's blood. He who burns incense as if he blesses an idol. Just as they have chosen their own ways, and their souls delight in their abominations." I thought it was relevant to here, but I think it relates more to identity, which, if you guys don't mind, I think should be our topic for next week, because it kind of starts to hint at when you attempt to define it yourself, that's where you start finding these faults, right? And the thoughts, that fear that we have inside ourselves of, you can tell everybody else what you did, but in here you really know what had happened. And then the other one I had was James 1:12, which is just, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." And we kind of mentioned that, right? Like eventually getting to this point, but this is kind of the real direction of it, right? Like there's going to be many opportunities in your life where your identity is going to be tested. Your true self is going to be tested, and you have to make that choice. Do I stay in line with the power source of who I'm supposed to be, or do I sort of go the other direction? So I guess I'm not necessarily asking a question for next week, but I'm merely leaving you with these two verses and Zay's beginning steps, because he's mentioned it now 2 weeks in a row, so it's got to be a sign of identity. And if you guys are okay with it, I think that should be the topic for next week. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, that's fine.
I make so I teach every Sunday morning, and then I preach that, like, I make a joke that every time it's always going to come back to identity and relationship.
So what you're saying is you're just going to talk about identity every week, and we should just pick random topics.
Pretty much, no, but I think it makes sense to focus on it, and I mean, like, the two verses you brought up are very different, but definitely have a lot in them going on. And I mean, Isaiah, I like Old Testament because a lot of people, it's really hard to understand how to pull stuff from the Old Testament.
This is why I'm
definitely cool starting there,
because I bring things from everywhere and I'm attempting to make sense of all of this stuff. But I'm grateful I have you two to help me through this. So
I think it's a good place to start, because so much of the world has kind of lost their identity and is seeking, so much of, you hear it all the time of, having to find themselves, and, I don't know who I am, and all, those kinds of phrases. And so much of that is the way our world perceives, people, the way people in our world perceive themselves and perceive each other, and, perceive or don't perceive God. So it's a very important thing to talk about, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for checking out this video. I want to thank Chris and Isaiah again for doing this with me. We are super grateful to be bringing you guys this talk, this information, and we are very, very grateful, even more grateful that you are watching these videos and tuning in. If you really like what you're seeing, feel free to hit the subscribe button and leave some comments below if you have topics you want to hear us talk about, if you have questions, or if you just have a response that you want to share with us. It could be an experience, an anecdote. And then stay tuned for next week when we will be bringing you our next topic on identity.